Greetings and welcome. Today we're turning to another atrocity, another evil of the 20th century, that is Stalin's terror and the Gulag, the set of prison camps, enslavement camps, which were created by Stalin and his secret police beginning in the 1930s and extending well after the death of Stalin. So Stalin's terror is one of the great evils, one of the great high impact extended moments of human suffering that the 20th century witnessed. The Russian Revolution, which began in about 1917, was guided by Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, and others in the 1920s, and it was a ruthlessly violent effort to transform the people and the territory of what became the Soviet Union from a largely agricultural economy with a very small industrial sector to a collective and collectivized industrial economy. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin all differed in a number of ways, but each of them believed and acted on the basis of the principle that any sacrifice of human life during the revolution could be justified on the basis of the eventual triumph of communism. Trotsky was very clear, and so was Lenin, and of course Stalin even more so, that empathy and pity were bourgeois emotions and needed to be exterminated in the pursuit of communism. Stalin added to this propensity to use violence a criminal's willingness, a thug's willingness to use violence and terror against his enemies. And Stalin defined his enemies in a very broad sense. So many millions of people in the Soviet Union fell under the rubric of enemies of Stalin. Just as one relatively small example, Stalin arranged the assassination of Leon Trotsky, his erstwhile rival, but now no longer a political threat to Stalin, in Mexico City in 1940. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, under Stalin's direction, classified much of Soviet society as enemies of the revolution and enemies of the people, and was determined to exterminate its enemies. It is significant, as we've discussed in talking about the Holodomor, the starvation campaign against the Ukrainians, that ordinary peasant families of Ukraine, many, many millions of them, were classified as enemies of the people. And the instrument through which the murderous intentions of the Communist Party and of Stalin were carried out against these so-called enemies were the secret police organizations. The secret police, the security apparatus, was a powerful force of coercion from the very inception of the Soviet state. There were several organizations which served this function, but during the period that we're talking about, the NKVD was the primary secret police and security agency in the 1930s through the 1950s. And the KGB was then the successor of the NKVD. The NKVD was entirely willing servant of the violent intentions of Stalin, and it directly executed. This is just an appalling fact, but this state agency, run ultimately at the will of Stalin, directly executed hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens in the 1930s and 1940s. There are estimates that go up to 750,000 and more who died as the result of execution during the terror. Stalin's great offensive against his enemies within the Communist Party began in 1937, and this led to wave after wave of purges in the military, the party, and state agencies. Purges means expulsion from a party, but it means also more than that. It means punishment, and punishment could be, and often was, severe. Removal of livelihood, being expelled from the party, being expelled from one's position, but then also the possibility of execution and enslavement. And in fact, hundreds of thousands of innocent Soviet citizens were accused, arrested on the basis of accusations of anti-revolutionary crimes, and were executed. Stalin conducted also a series of highly publicized political trials against the highest theoreticians and communist activists of the Communist Party, including Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Rykov. And during these trials, these men, quote, confessed to wrecking and sabotaging the revolution and were subsequently arrested. They had been subject to physical torture, moral torture, and extortion, and their families were threatened with violence unless they confessed. Arthur Koestler, the very remarkable Hungarian novelist, essayist, and journalist, his most notable novel is called Darkness at Noon, which was a fictional portraiture of the arrest, trial, and execution of a Communist Party official, Rubashov. And Koestler tries to make sense of the reasons why a courageous and committed communist leader like Rubashov or like Bukharin would confess to completely ridiculous crimes which he could not possibly have committed. The purges extended also to the army, to the Red Army, and to the officer corps, and the massive damage to the senior officer corps occurred only 2 years before Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin was wildly reckless in his desire to remove, quote, enemies from leadership positions in the Army Corps. Many thousands of officers were purged, killed, or sent to the Gulag. And the abject failure of the Red Army to be able to organize both defense and offense against Nazi Germany during the first year of Germany's invasion can be attributed to the lack of experienced military officers. And this was a military catastrophe for the Soviet Union, but it was also a human catastrophe because it led to many hundreds of thousands of battlefield deaths and several million prisoner of war casualties who eventually, as we've seen in a previous student presentation, almost all of them died of starvation and abuse. So the terror involved not only mass execution, but it also involved imprisonment and the use of slave labor. In addition to the murder of a vast number of innocent Soviet citizens, the terror created a systematic use of imprisonment of political prisoners to be used as slave labor on huge infrastructure projects, including timber and lumber, road building, mines, dams, railroads, and so forth. And many of these camps were located in the most inhospitable parts of Russian and Soviet territory, in the far north, north of the Arctic Circle often, and in the far east, in the Pacific and Asian regions of the Soviet Union. Conditions in the camps were extremely harsh, with very poor access to food, very poor nutrition, extremely harsh, cold temperatures, labor with very poor equipment, very poor clothing, under very cold conditions, and consequently with very high mortality. And this is what we now refer to as the Gulag. At its peak, Anne Applebaum, whose book you've read and which we'll be discussing, she estimates that about 3 million prisoners were, 2 million prisoners were imprisoned in the Gulag at one time at the peak of the prison population. But about 18 million people in the Soviet Union passed through the prison camps after sentences from 5 years to 15 years. And all of them had their lives hugely affected by the experience which they had in the Gulag. Here's a map of the location of camps, and it's kind of devastating to see that they are spread all over the Soviet Union. Kolyma, the camp that we'll be talking about shortly, is in the far east of the Soviet Union. But there's a whole range of camps up in the Arctic area of the very northern part of Russia. The majority of camps, though not necessarily the majority of prisoners, are in European Russia, around the Urals and then west of the Urals. But as you see, there are also camps, Gulag camps, prison camps, slave labor camps, south of Moscow, extending into Ukraine. And on this map, Ukraine is portrayed as part of the Soviet Union, as indeed it was a socialist republic during the 30s and 40s. So the book that you read, Anne Applebaum's book, The Gulag, this is one of the most extensive and well-researched historical treatments of the Gulag that you can find. It is interesting to me, and I think probably to you as well, that Anne Applebaum is still an active journalist and essayist, and she has written extensively about Russia's atrocious war against the Ukraine. We've also read her magnificent study of the Holodomor earlier in the semester. And in this book, she documents the astonishing extent, the size and geographical spread of the Gulag, and the immense suffering which it created for the Soviet population at large. Almost every family was affected in some way. But also she documents the extremely harsh, cruel, and often deadly conditions of labor and confinement that were imposed on the prisoners. So the Gulag was a human atrocity against millions of people enacted by the totalitarian state that was the Stalinist Soviet Union. Kolyma, as you saw from the map, was one of the largest and also one of the most notorious of the prison camp complexes. It was located in the extreme northeastern part of Siberia, and Applebaum refers to this as the most inhospitable part of Russia. Inhospitable because of the extreme cold, the underdeveloped infrastructure that was available, poor housing for prisoners, for example, and then on top of that, the very poor quality and quantity of clothing, poor nutrition, and poor health conditions which were provided for prisoners. These camps were a place to labor under extreme hardship and often to die. Here's her explanation of the meaning of the word gulag, quoting from Applebaum. Literally, the word gulag is an acronym meaning the Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagerai, or main camp administration. Over time, the word gulag has also come to signify not only the administration of the concentration camps, but also the system of Soviet slave labor itself in all its forms and varieties: labor camps, punishment camps, criminal and political camps, women's camps, children's camps, transit camps. Even more broadly, gulag has come to mean the Soviet repressive system itself, the set of procedures that prisoners once called the meat grinder: the arrests, the interrogations, the transport in unheated cattle cars, the forced labor, the destruction of families, the years spent in exile, the early and unnecessary deaths. I'm sure you've heard of Solzhenitsyn's major novel, not novel really, but documentary book called The Gulag Archipelago, which reflects Solzhenitsyn's own experience in the Gulag. And it was the first piece of literature which made it to the West to explain in detail how extensive the Gulag was and what horrendous conditions were imposed on the prisoners of the Gulag. Here's another quote from Anne Applebaum on the severity of conditions imposed on prisoners. The first convoy contained 5,070 people, and the second 1,044. The transport conditions were appalling. The little food that was available was inedible, and the deportees were cramped into nearly airtight spaces. The result was a daily mortality rate of 35 to 40 people. These living conditions, however, proved to be luxurious in comparison to what awaited the deportees on the island of Nazino. The island of Nazino is a totally uninhabited place, devoid of any settlements. There were no tools, no grain, no food. This is how their new life began. The day after the arrival of the first convoy on 19 May, snow began to fall again, and the wind picked up. Starving, emaciated from months of insufficient food, without shelter, without tools, they were trapped. They weren't even able to light fires to ward off the cold. More and more of them began to die. This is a murder machine. The Gulag was a murder machine. And it was also, very cynically, a way of accomplishing two goals that Stalin had. One was to repress and terrorize any possible opposition, whether it was of farmer people in the Ukraine or of political rivals in Moscow. His terror machine, the Gulag, and the execution system was intended to intimidate and repress any possible opposition. And these purges and murders were entirely systematic, entirely deliberate, and entirely state-initiated. They were a symptom of a psychotic totalitarian regime. And as we've seen in the Nazi case, this was a bureaucratic process, a process that could not have worked without ministries and offices and people like Eichmann, who did the daily work of coordinating and organizing transports. Consider this chilling, horrific table on the next slide. It lists quotas for punishments in the time period of 1937 during the purges of that year. First category punishment is summary execution. Second category is the Gulag. This is a bureaucrat's spreadsheet, which has marked about 10,000 people anonymously, unknown people. It's not a list of people who need to be punished. It is a quota who need to be gathered up in each republic and subject to either primary punishment or secondary punishment for no reason, no evidence, and no process. Another 45,000 are sent to the Gulag. And by the way, this list is only the first half or so of the alphabet in the alphabetical list of the republics. So just take a quick look at this list from Azerbaijan to Komi towards the bottom, and the numbers of people. In Azerbaijan, 1,500 people were the quota of the communist authorities and NKVD units in Azerbaijan. 1,500 people, 1,500 people were to be arrested and summarily executed. To take another example, Georgia, 2,000 people were to be arrested and summarily executed. These are horrific numbers, horrific. It is a horrific document because it sounds like ordering bread, but it's actually ordering the deaths of, in the end, tens of thousands of people across the whole Soviet Union. There's an interesting twist in some of the material that Anne Applebaum shares with us. We've talked a lot about lies and the concealment of evil. We've seen that evil events are often concealed through lies and phony claims. But here's an interesting example from the Gulag, quoting from Applebaum. For more specific references, both to camps and to the activities of their inhabitants, the NKVD devised an elaborate code which could be used in open telegrams so that people who intercepted the telegrams wouldn't know what they were talking about. A document from 1940 listed these code names, sometimes bizarrely creative. Pregnant women were to be referred to as books, and women with children as receipts. Men, on the other hand, were accounts. Exiles were rubbish, and prisoners undergoing investigation were envelopes. A camp was a trust, and a camp division was a factory. One camp was codenamed Free. So you can just imagine a sample telegram, a transport of 500 books, 800 receipts, and 1,000 accounts has been accepted at our envelope, at our trust, and will be processed accordingly. It's kind of a crazy code concealing a horrific human reality. It's also a major part of Soviet history and the history of Soviet culture and literature during this period that writers and poets were special targets of Stalinist violence. Russia, before the revolution, and even in the first 20 years following the revolution, Russia had a simply distinguished history in world literature, including Tolstoy and Pushkin and Dostoevsky and many other novelists, poets, short story writers. And this did extend into the early part of the revolutionary period. But during the Stalinist period, writers and poets had to be extremely careful about the language that they used, because the purges extended to any kind of dissident, anyone who expressed a whisper of doubt or lack of trust and allegiance for Stalin. So writers, poets, Jews, ethnic groups, Trotskyites, all were suspect. Here are a few lines from the poet Osip Mandelstam. "We live, not feeling the land beneath us. We speak, and 10 steps away, no one hears us. But where there's even a whispered conversation, the Kremlin's mountaineer, murderer, and peasant slayer will be mentioned." You can guess who that phrase in the last line of this poem that I've quoted refers to. It refers to Stalin. And for these words, Mandelstam was arrested and sent to the Gulag. And after just a few years of confinement, he died at the age of 47. One of the prisoners in the Gulag who survived the Gulag and survived the most horrendous life experience over a period of 15 years was Varlam Shalamov. You've heard his name before in the course, but Shalamov is the author of Kolyma Tales. He was a political prisoner in Kolyma for 15 years. He was an activist during the very first stages of the Russian Revolution, but he was a left communist, and he was suspected of Trotskyite sympathies. He was also an aspiring writer and poet. And after his release, after his 15 years of hard labor, harsh conditions, horrible health and nutrition conditions, after his release in the 1960s and after the death of Stalin, he wrote a number of stories about life in Kolyma, which you've now read parts of. These stories express the horrific conditions of life and labor that were experienced by prisoners in the Gulag. Here are a couple of passages that I find very expressive. "Supper was over. Glebov took his time licking his bowl clean, then carefully raked the breadcrumbs off the table into his left hand, which he lifted to his mouth so as to lick every crumb off his palm. Without swallowing them, he could feel the saliva in his mouth greedily covering the tiny lump of bread in a thick layer. Glebov could not have said whether it tasted good. Taste was something different, too weak, compared with the passionate, oblivious feeling that food gave him. Glebov took his time before swallowing. The bread melted in his mouth, and it melted quickly." This is from the story At Night. Shalamov also drew some very sobering lessons or conclusions or observations from his time in the camps. And unlike Viktor Frankl, whom we've referred to as a survivor of Auschwitz, unlike Frankl, Shalamov's lessons are all bleak and negative. One, the extreme fragility of human culture, civilization. A man becomes a beast in 3 weeks, given heavy labor, cold, hunger, and beatings. 2, the main means for depraving the soul is the cold. Presumably in Central Asian camps, people held out longer, for it was warmer there. 3, I realized that friendship, comradeship would never arise in really difficult, life-threatening conditions. Friendship arises only in difficult but bearable conditions. In the hospital, but not at the pit face. 4, I realized that the feeling a man preserves longest is anger. There's only enough flesh on a hungry man for anger. Everything else leaves him indifferent. 5, I realized that Stalin's victories were due to his killing of the innocent. An organization a tenth the size would have swept Stalin away in 2 days. 6, I realized that humans were human because they were physically stronger and clung to life more than any other animal. No horse can survive working in the far north. Again, I draw your attention to the bleakness of these observations. If Shalamov were a political philosopher or a philosopher of human nature, the philosophy that he expresses here is unredeemably negative and bleak. So I look forward to a good conversation with you about the Gulag, about what it means, about its connection to totalitarianism and to Stalinism. But I want to close with a couple of passages from Vasily Grossman, since we've enjoyed Grossman's writings. And this is from Grossman's final novel, which was unfinished at the time of his death, Everything Flows. And the novel is about a man who has been released from the Gulag after the death of Stalin and who's returning to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, where he was originally denounced and consigned to the Gulag. And he's reflecting on the train and when he arrives at his destination. So there are 2 quotations I want to end with. During his 29 years as a prisoner, he had dreamed several times of his childhood. Once he had dreamed of a small bay. The water was calm, the bottom was covered with pebbles, and some little crabs had hurried past, moving sideways and silently in their underwater way, and disappeared into the seaweed. He had walked slowly around the rounded stones, feeling the gentle touch of the seagrass on his feet, and then dozens of elongated drops of quicksilver, baby scad and mackerel, had spurted up out of the water and scattered. The sun had lit up the green underwater meadows and clumps of spruce, and this beloved little bay had seemed to be filled not with such and so, but also with such and so. But now, how did this person wind up in the Gulag? Here we turn to his cousin, a scientist who has done perfectly well during the Stalinist period, Nikolai Andreevich. And Nikolai Andreevich is dreading meeting his cousin now that he's been released. But now Nikolai Andreevich remembered that there had been doubt. His certainty of Bukharin's guilt had been a pretense. Even if he had been certain in his heart and soul of Bukharin's complete innocence, he would still have voted for the death penalty. And so it had been easier for him not to doubt, to pretend to himself that he had no doubts. It was impossible for him not to vote for the death penalty. He believed, after all, in the ideals of the party of Lenin and Stalin. He believed, after all, that a socialist society, a society without private property, had been constructed for the first time in history, and that socialism required the dictatorship of the state. To have the least doubt about Bukharin's guilt, to have refused to vote, would have meant that he had doubts about this mighty state. So that's the scientist's doubts and the kind of moral dilemma that he felt during the trial of Bukharin, the show trial that I referred to earlier. But now fear, Nikolai Andreevich's fears. This is a page or so later, which again is intended to try to explain Andreevich's or Nikolai Andreevich's behavior. Yes, his whole life had passed by in obeisance, in a great act of submission, in fear of hunger, torture, and forced labor in Siberia. Fear of hunger, torture, and forced labor. But there had also been a particularly vile fear, the fear of receiving not black caviar, but red caviar, mere salmon caviar, in his weekly parcel of food from the Institute. And this vile caviar fear had co-opted his adolescent dreams from the time of war communism. It had made use of them for its own shameful ends. What mattered was to have no doubts or hesitations. What mattered was to give his vote, to sign his name without a second thought. Yes, what had nourished his unshakable ideals was two very different fears: fear for his own skin, of being skinned alive, and fear of losing his entitlement to a bit of black caviar. This is very insightful psychology on Grossman's part, and he's really trying to understand how is it that privileged people in the Soviet Union did not stand up against Stalin. And his answer is contained in this paragraph, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about it. Thanks.